A little while back I made a video looking back at the highest rated and best-selling games of the year 2000, one of the most stacked years in all of gaming, to give a little bit of a window into what the games industry looked like at the time. But 2001 was no slouch either. In fact, you could really argue that it's even bigger. The launches of the GameCube, Game Boy Advance, and Xbox marked the full leap into the next console generation. Two of the most important games of all time released less than a month apart and completely changed the landscape of this industry, and we even got one of the internet's most misinterpreted scenes of all time. So let's look back at this year in gaming history with the best, most acclaimed, and most successful games of 2001. Now, just like last time, we're going to look at the best-selling games first, but in this case, it's a little bit trickier than 2000 was, thanks to even more of 2001's biggest games not releasing in Europe until 2002. Like, even just on a console level, the GameCube and Xbox dropped in spring of 2002 throughout Europe, so tracking sales within just the 2001 calendar year doesn't quite paint the fullest of pictures. I've done the best I could at putting together a general takeaway with one honorable mention as well. First things first, Pokemon once again took home the crown for the fourth straight year. Gen 2 was again the global winner in 2001 thanks to the US release of Crystal, the European releases of Gold and Silver, and of course a ton of long-tail sales of those earlier versions in regions where they'd already been released. Now, obviously, there's always the technically that's 3 games, not one thing, but hold that thought for just a second. Had Nintendo's localization strategy been a little more optimized in 2002, they would have kept this streak going for 6 total years with Ruby and Sapphire before finally falling in 2004 to Grand Theft Auto. I mentioned GTA here because Grand Theft Auto 3 took second place in the year 2001, starting a multi-year stretch of jostling back and forth with Pikachu for the annual sales crown. Now, we all know today that while the first 2 GTA games were known quantities and did perform pretty well, GTA 3 blew the series onto the map, and that it's today one of the best-selling video games of all time, so this one shouldn't be a surprise either. Fun fact, GTA 3 was also the number 2 best-selling game in 2002 in America, behind Vice City. However, it's not like GTA 3 would have beaten out even one of the 3 Pokemon games for the best-selling crown. Gold and Silver's European sales alone netted $200 million at the time, more than GTA's worldwide numbers, and that's before we factor in the 3 million sales that came from the US, Japan, and elsewhere. Even if it didn't hold a candle in this particular year, GTA was on the way to build a fan base that would compete in sales with the biggest media franchise of all time at the peak of that franchise's popularity, and that is nothing to slouch at. What might feel like a surprise is that 2001's other most important game, Halo, is just not here. Halo's commercial success was much more of a slow burn than we may remember today, partly because only Americans had the chance to play it in 2001, and partly because it was on a brand new console family that people weren't necessarily rushing out to get right away. Once the hype and word of mouth started spreading, though, that Halo hype train really started rolling. It also didn't help in Halo's case that the launch lineup for the Xbox was, well, it was certainly something, with hits like NHL Hits 20-02 and Shrek. If you weren't interested in Halo, Dead or Alive 3, Project Gotham Racing, or Oddworld Munch's Odyssey, you weren't buying an Xbox for a while. As a result of all of this, and the GameCube also not releasing in Europe until 2002, 2001 ended up being a very PlayStation 2 year, with Gran Turismo 3, Final Fantasy X, Metal Gear Solid 2, and even Madden 2002 taking up most of the rest of the bestsellers lineup, despite the last 3 of those also either not releasing in Europe yet, or in Madden's case, being a sport that only the US cared about at the time, and really still today, although apparently it's been gaining traction slowly but surely elsewhere. Shout out to Germany for liking American football, I guess. Sandwiched in the middle of this bestsellers list, though, is a little bit of Europe's influence by way of the first Harry Potter movie tie-in, a 2001 PS1 title. Well, to be fair, it also released on Windows and both the Game Boy Color and Advance, with all 4 of these versions being completely different games. The same is true for the next-gen Sorcerer's Stone title that released a few years later, a completely different game than even this one, or than these 4, so there are 5 versions of this game that exist which is kind of wild. Thanks to strong sales in both the US and Europe, the PC version of this game was one of the best-selling computer games of the decade. The PS1 game, despite releasing after the PS2, quickly became a top seller and eventually ended up as the number 6 PS1 game of all time, above every single Crash Bandicoot game, and only behind 2 Final Fantasies, 2 Gran Turismos, and the 3rd Tekken. All of this despite getting pretty mid-reviews no matter which version you were playing. That PS1 version, by the way, believe it or not, developed by Argonaut Software, the same team that made the early Star Fox games, and whose founder, Jez Sand, was in this very same year of 2001, the first game designer to receive Order of the British Empire honors. Whether that award was for his contributions to the gaming industry or for Croc actually being the inspiration behind the classical British knighthood system, it's still unclear. With all of the hits that lined the PS2's first full year on the market, what would you think is the first game for the system to hit 1 million global sales? Final Fantasy? Gran Turismo? GTA 3? As you can probably guess, it's none of those. It's actually Onimusha, Capcom's often self-proclaimed samurai Resident Evil game, which flew off the shelves so quickly in Japan when it dropped in January that by the time of its March release in the US, it had already gone platinum. Onimusha is quietly one of the more important games in Capcom's contemporary history too, as a gameplay bug here that allowed you to juggle enemies is what would lead to the concept for Devil May Cry's combat, which in turn may have helped drive that game further down its own path and away from its original plan of being Resident Evil 4. It's another one of those examples of a game that today we may look at as a footnote at best, but that was in its own era a much bigger deal. Although, to be fair, in Onimusha's case, it helps that the rest of the games in the series very much so bombed sales-wise. This was a one-hit wonder of a series. Wrapping up our bestsellers list, we have Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, because of course it is 2001 and skating was still at its peak, the 2 Zelda Oracle games for Game Boy Color, benefiting heavily from the Pokemon-styled 2-version FOMO, except in this case, they were actually different games, and Super Mario Advance, the remake of Super Mario Bros. 2 USA, which benefited from being one of the GBA's launch titles. And really, one of the only ones, with games like Army Men Advance, High Heat Baseball 2002, and a port of the 1994 Pitfall game for some reason. If you were buying a GBA at launch, you were probably going to be sticking with Mario, F-Zero doubtfully, maybe Rayman, or, if you have good taste, Sega's Choo Choo Rocket, the first Sega game to release on Nintendo. Or, I suppose, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 GBA, which once again ended up as one of the year's highest rated games. Whether the GBA version is worth the actual critical acclaim it received, or if it's just one of those technical marvels that ended up with a bit of an inflated score because, wow, you made Tony Hawk on the Game Boy Advance, that's kinda wild, that's up to you to decide. Now, for that honorable mention, I do have to shout out one game that did release in 2001, whose player count was certainly impressive back then, but has only continued expanding over time into a global powerhouse: RuneScape. Not only was RuneScape technically the first game released in 2001, back when it was still a browser game, it continually has gained new eyes thanks to word of mouth. There really weren't that many easily accessible PC games that any kid could just find and play around this time. It was pretty much just this and Neopets, so RuneScape ended up becoming something of a constant throughout the subsequent 2 decades. And so, although it may not have actual sales figures, with a few 100 million accounts floating around today and several 100,000 daily players, I think it's worth mentioning. In 2001's case, the Venn diagram between the best-selling and best-reviewed games is pretty close to a circle. If we're going by an aggregator like Metascore, which, like I said last time, I don't really like doing for modern titles, but from a historical perspective it's a little more valuable, Tony Hawk once again took up top honors. Pro Skater 3 ended up a hair's length ahead in a functional 3-way tie with GTA 3 and Halo 1, and like I mentioned a moment ago, the GBA version of Pro Skater 2 somehow landed at number 6 of the top 10 best-rated games. If you weren't around or paying attention at the time, you really just have no way of truly understanding Tony Hawk's pure animal magnetism. Yes, I just said that, and no, I'm not going to re-record it. Other games like MGS2, Gran Turismo 3, Madden, Final Fantasy X, these all doubled up between the bestsellers list and the most acclaimed list. The football one actually outscored Final Fantasy, and if you're wrinkling your nose at that, do remember that this was still in that era where sports games were usually trying to actually improve every year. They were some of the most impressive technical showcases every year, and that critics were much more often scoring games on their own merits rather than feeding into the ridiculous assumption that a lot of the consumers have nowadays that all 9 out of 10 scoring games have to be an equal 9 out of 10. Back then, a sports game 9 out of 10 or a Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 Game Boy Advance 9 out of 10 didn't mean that it was better than a Final Fantasy X or a GTA or a Halo. It just meant that for what the game was trying to be, it was really good at it. It's kind of alien nowadays, I know. Of course, back then you usually tried reading the review too, instead of just looking for the number at the very end and getting angry. That's not really a thing anymore, except for when you're scrolling back up and looking for examples of why you're angry after having seen and looked for the score first. But although most of this year had some sort of parity between the sales and critical hits, there were some exceptions. Games that maybe didn't break through on the sales charts, but did hit it off with those that did buy and with critics alike, usually thanks to these games having regional release dates, in turn splitting the sales figures across multiple years. For example, Paper Mario 64 is technically a 2000 video game, but the localizations outside of Japan dropped throughout 2001, making it one of the final N64 games to market. But that game rightfully received rave reviews. Paper Mario rules. Same goes for Conker's Bad Fur Day, which dropped almost exactly a month later in the States and absolutely bombed despite being one of the most acclaimed games of the year. Whether Conker quite holds up today is probably up to you to decide, but at the time, a parody of both N64 collectathon mechanics and also a bunch of pop culture and movies and other TV type things, it was pretty good, it was pretty cool. I'd venture a guess to say that Conker was Nintendo's single biggest failure on the N64, between its long development hell, it being one of, I believe, only 4 games to use the expensive 64MB cartridges thanks to its full voice acting, Nintendo choosing to pass that cost onto the consumer by pricing this game at $60, which is about $100 today, and even back then was $10 more than PS2 games and $20 plus more than most PS1 games, and then there's the whole heavily adult-oriented game on a console mainly marketed towards children thing. Yeah, this game hurt them. Some other well-reviewed 2001 games include the absolute classic snowboarding game that is SSX Tricky, the first Devil May Cry game, Super Smash Bros. Melee, the Zelda Oracle games, Twisted Metal Black, and a bunch of GBA titles, stuff like Castlevania Circle of the Moon, Golden Sun, Mario Kart, and Advance Wars, which may just be the most cursed Nintendo franchise of all time. See, Advance Wars didn't actually come out in Japan until 2004, and it was delayed a few months in Europe because this game came out in America on September 10th, 2001. This is the very same Advance Wars game whose remake was delayed a full year in 2022 thanks to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. None of that is very fun, and I didn't think of a good transition here, so I just want to highlight just how many games dropped in 2001 by letting you know that there are another 20-something games that I could have mentioned due to their general acclaim, especially nowadays in many cases. Stuff like Ico, Jak and Daxter, Peter Molyneux's at the time newest God game Black and White, Star Wars Rogue Leader, Civilization 3, Silent Hill 2, Klonoa 2, Max Payne, Pikmin, Sonic Adventure 2, which yes, did review really well, markedly better than its GameCube port a few months later, both Ace Attorney and Ace Combat. The list just keeps going, and some of these are already outside the top 40 for the year. There is a reason this is considered one of the landmark years for game enjoyers. And even still, at the end of the day, it did just come down to 3 games at the top of the ladder for many, if not most, and none of them, thankfully, are Tony Hawk. When it came time to award 2001's Game of the Year, Metal Gear Solid 2 took a distant 3rd place in overall awards behind Grand Theft Auto 3 and Halo, with Halo, by my count, taking the most awards overall. I know how easy it may be to look at the current landscape and not fully perceive how huge both of these titles were. I mean, for most of the subsequent decade, practically every game was either an open world with an attempt at a living, breathing world, or an FPS, and while both genres certainly obviously existed before Halo and GTA, these were the ones that changed the game, especially on console. There is a reason companies like Naughty Dog immediately pivoted after GTA's release and moved away from the tried and true genres that had held firm in the prior generation. A game like Jak 1 should have, and to be fair, did receive a ton of love for taking the collectathon platformer to the next-gen level, and for all of the cool little tech innovations like completely masking loading so that you never really left the world just to see a loading screen. However, Jak also came out a few weeks after GTA, and it did get some flack for being just another kid-friendly platformer that got the short straw of releasing just after the game that completely leveled the landscape. And don't just take it from my retelling here. Pretty much anybody in the games industry around 2001 to 2002 and onward or before that has ever spoken about their work has pointed to Grand Theft Auto 3's release as the single biggest pivot point they had ever seen. The only time that everything truly changed overnight for everybody. Obviously, part of that's due to the market response, it's a sales thing, but it was also the game's seamless combination of different systems and elements, the kind of things that just weren't possible to this degree on earlier hardware. From the now admittedly simplistic NPC traffic patterns, the pedestrians, the game's way of immersing you further into this cynical parody world by way of hours and hours of radio dialogue, of course for many, the pure amount of chaos you could cause, for the weird minority of players like me, the decently strong mission variety packed into a sometimes generic but usually fun crime drama story. Everything about this game was seen as next level, not just for players, but for those working on games too, wondering how the hell Rockstar pulled off X, or Y, or God forbid, even Z. Don't talk about Z too much though, it's kind of controversial, and if word spreads too much, Nintendo may just delay the Advance Wars remake another time. And then for only weeks later, the same thing to be true for Halo completely changing the landscape. I mean, man, we were spoiled. If you weren't really active as a player or game consumer before like 2010 at least, it's maybe even harder than with GTA for one to fully process how big of a deal Halo was. The first game's reputation eventually became so mythical that the releases of Halo 2, 3, and Reach were all truly events. 4 too, but after 4 things started to change. Midnight launches existed before Halo 2, but Halo 2 is where it got real. Purely off of the first game's reputation and hype alone, Halo 2 became the fastest selling piece of media in US history. A few years later, Halo 3 shattered that record because of the genuinely millions and millions of people that were now Xbox gamers because of Halo and often Halo alone. You don't impact a genre so hard that every other game in the genre tries to market itself as a you killer without you being something special. You don't single-handedly launch not just a console but an entire brand of consoles and get called the most important launch game for any console ever if you can't back it up. You don't get away with making the library level unless your game is truly that damn good that people kind of give you a pass for that one. Every game studio was playing Halo in its free time or sometimes during work hours. Everybody was taking some sort of inspiration from it as multiplayer console gaming started to blossom. And the kicker is that Halo wasn't even supposed to be the Xbox's marquee title, it just ended up being all that was left after all the other games got canned. But the story of Halo is probably a longer one to save for another day when I feel like being angry about how they massacred my boy, and also, I don't really want to end this video on a bummer, so instead I'll point you to another video I made about this era in the world of gaming. If you haven't seen it yet, check out my documentary on the behind-the-scenes chaos at Sega in the early 2000s that led to Sonic's game director losing 20 pounds due to several months of straight production crunch, along with so much more that I can't even begin to talk about here. Actually, wait, that video is also a bummer way to end this one. Well, screw it, too late now. As always, until next time, stay golden. A special thanks to my wonderful Patreon supporters over at the Golden Cult for helping make videos like this possible. You can get early video access and add your name here for as little as $1 a month over at patreon.com/thegoldenbolt. In particular, a shout out to my Silverbolt and above level supporters, including Goldstorm07, Cloudy Boy, Josh G, Jumprock, Common CJ, Karatana, Malcavio, Mason Hunt, Philly D360, Phyrexian Sleeper Agent, Rodney220, The Critic of Innocence, Thomas Kuzma, Arlen B, Captain Squid, Chef Kilo, Cranky, Damian W, Eclipse 2025, Epo90, Even Luck, Harry Baker, HCSP1, Hotzi, I Pay My Cam Girls So Why Not You, Ibathon, James Boss, JTart9, Justin Gregoire, Maxi89C, The Milkman, Moises, Ninja Master, Patrick Jackson, Rye, Shadow Nexus, Stefan, Terminally Nerdy, Wayne is Boss, WDog999, William Bundy, and Buckles Chucklow. Thank you.